Okay, welcome to another live read from Quentin Tarantino's Cinema Speculation. Tonight we're going to get into section 7. A bit of a tongue tied there. My cat is with me. He'll be joining in the reading. I'm just going to wait a second as perhaps people might join in on the read. So I'm just going to wait a while. We've already read 6 other sections in the book. Pretty good read. They're all the live reads are available. You can go to a playlist called "A Collection of Books I Read." So, Second String Samurai: An Appreciation of Kevin Thomas. I want to say it's about 20 pages or so. We're going to get through them tonight. So, without further ado, like they did with Angels Hard as They Come and The Hot Box, Jonathan Demme and Evelyn Purcell killed themselves making the woman in person drama Caged Heat for Roger Corman. Only this time it's Jonathan as the director and Evelyn as a producer and second unit director. And now the day had finally come when their little WIP whip potboiler would finally be released to the theaters and drive-ins around Los Angeles, where it played citywide along Melvin Van Peebles' Sweetback's Badass song as a supporting feature. But after all the hard work, there was a little fatalism among the Merit filmmaking team. According to longtime Demme associate Gary Goetzman, yeah, they knew they made a good little picture for Roger, but ultimately, so what? Who's going to see a sleazy little New World Pictures film called Cage Heat, other than the drive-in crowd it was made for? Even when Jonathan and Evelyn met people around town and mentioned they just made a movie, people would ask, what was it called? When they said Caged Heat, they'd see the contemptible expression on their faces. What? Is it a porno? The couple were still happy and excited, but they understood the reality of making exploitation movies in Hollywood. When it came to Caged Heat, opening in Los Angeles, Hollywood wouldn't care. The industry wouldn't care, the press wouldn't care, and the public, save for a few teenage drive-in patrons, wouldn't care. Hey, what's up, everybody? Rodolfo, Cloudy T. In fact, the only person who would care would be Roger Corman, and to get Corman to offer them another flick is about all they could hope for. So imagine Demme and Purcell surprised when the day after the film opened, they paged through the Los Angeles Times and read a rave review by Kevin Thomas of their punky little prison picture. After making clear his contempt for the woman in prison subgenre, especially the Jack Hill Eddie Romero Filipino variety, Thomas wrote about Demme's first film as a director. With wit, style, and unflagging verve, writer-director Jonathan Demme, a youthful and talented exploitation veteran, sends up the genre while still giving the mindless action fan his money's worth. His, his money's worth. Demme, best known for Angels Hard as They Come, manages not only to have it both ways, but also in pointing up the absurdity of the genre, points up the absurdity of the often cruel and inhumane conditions of real life prisons. Then he ended his review the way all New World Pictures directors wish the Los Angeles Times would end the review for their pictures. In every aspect, Cage Heat attests to Demme's virtuosity, and cinematographer Tak Fujimoto and his composer John Kells as well, and thereby demonstrates that all three of them are ready for major projects. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. I just get notifications from stuff that I get. Sorry. If you're going to speak about the early career of Jonathan Demme, you need to speak about his biggest champion, second string critic for the Los Angeles Times, Kevin Thomas. Later, Citizens Band. Demi had a whole host of critics acting as a cheering section. But before Vincent Canby, before Richard Corliss, before Kenny Turan, before Pauline Kael and her Paulettes fell in line behind Demi. The critic most responsible for the young filmmaker's career progression was Kevin Thomas. One of the things that I had forgotten, but reading those reviews of the outfit was quickly reminded of, was what Elvis Mitchell called the institutional indifference to even studio-backed genre product by the newspaper-based critics of the day. It would appear most critics writing for newspapers and magazines set themselves up as superior to the films they were paid to review, which I could never understand because, judging from their writing, that was clearly not the case. They looked down on films that gave pleasure and on the filmmakers who had an understanding of the audience that they did not. And we're talking about The Outfit, a solid studio film based on a good book with sensational actors. Forget about the beneath contempt treatment actual exploitation flicks received at their hands. As a kid who loved movies and paid to see pretty much everything, I just thought they were snide assholes. Today, as a much older and wiser man, I realize the extent of how unhappy they must have been. They wrote with the demeanor of somebody who hates their life, or at least hates their job. For 20 years, almost comically, the Los Angeles Times, a newspaper of the motion picture industry, hired critical laughingstocks for their first string movie critic positions. The New York Times had Vincent Canby, a good voice for that publication. The Chicago Sun-Times had Roger Ebert, who, when inspiration struck him, would examine an offbeat aspect of the film under analysis, like the fact that the Frank Perry film Diary of a Mad Housewife was told from the perspective of an unreliable narrator. By virtue, it was a diary. And despite him and his high-minded colleague Gene Siskel's showboating hissy fit against slasher films in the 80s. Roger was a friend to exploitation films, giving good reviews to The Last House on the Left, Electric Boogaloo is Breaking 2, and Inframan, as well as writing the screenplay for the all-time classic Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. But in the 70s, the LA Times had blurb whore Charles Chucky Champlin, who reviewed movies the way Ralph Williams sold cars. In Los Angeles, he was known as the Will Rogers of film criticism. Charles Champlin never met a movie he didn't like. Champlin wrote it as if in as if many movie ad pull quotes as possible was an editorial imperative. Also, for years, he hosted an interview show on local LA television called At One with, where he'd sit across from actors like Gene Hackman and filmmakers like John Frankenheimer. So he wouldn't do himself or his local LA celebrity status any favors by being rough with the Hollywood citizens in their hometown newspaper. Nevertheless, Champlin was preferable preferable to the person who took his spot in the 80s, Sheila Benson. Benson pretty much ruined the calendar section of the Los Angeles Times for a decade. Her movie reviews read closer to book reports written by a housewife for a night school class on modern American lit. Back then, I only cared about critics' opinions and personality. I never judged their actual writing ability, except Sheila Benson. Myself and my first girlfriend, Grace Lovelace, both of us Pauline Kael devotees, used to quote Sheila Benson reviews to make the other one smirk during dinners together in the 90s. Film critic colleagues Manola Dargis and John Powers drew hearty laughs from everyone at the table by mocking Benson's writing style. But it's not like Benson did have her constituency. To give the devil her due, in a strange way, Sheila Benson was rather an inappropriate voice for the Hollywood studio films coming out of the miserable 80s. The middle of the road, successful films of that era were right up Benson's alley. The Big Chill, Out of Africa, Ordinary People, Dinner, Gandhi, Stand By Me, those films were Benson's cup of weak tea. The problem was her first string critic position. Writing for another venue other than the Los Angeles fucking Times, Benson could have been a perfectly acceptable critic. If Benson, with her PTA mentality, had been writing the movie page for McCall magazine, did Redbook have a movie page? the writer and her readers would have found a happy home. Pauline Kael was fired by McCall for her opinions. Benson would have been so beloved by the readership, they probably would have issued a movie coupon with a picture of her face in the middle of it. They could have been called Benson Bucks. In the 90s, Benson went bye bye and was replaced by Kenny Turan. Now, compared to Chaplin, who might as well have worked for the advertising department, and Benson, who was simply unfit for her position, Kenny Turan was a real critic, but a real critic you really wanted to read. Krishna, what's up? Now, it must be noted for the length of my career at my hometown newspaper, Kenny set himself up to be my nemesis. Turan wasn't the only critic to give Pulp Fiction a bad review, but his review wasn't just a pan of a movie he didn't care for, it had an agenda. To counteract Todd McCarthy's and Janet Maslin's once in a lifetime raves in Variety and the New York Times, I thought maybe I'd get him with Jackie Brown, but no such luck. Then, for the next few years, Kenny made it a point to bring me up as a negative example of what was wrong with current cinema in every think piece he wrote. And one about Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, he didn't just run me over, he drove around the block to run me over. Turan's animosity towards my work has persisted throughout my career, to such a degree when he finally responded positively to my film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he felt the need to explain to the readers the degree to which he had dismissed my work in the past, though by that time the only one keeping score was me. When you share an antagonism with one critic for as long as Kenny and me, you end up having a strange personal connection with each other. The few times we bumped into each other at an event, we've shared a moment of professional mutual rejection that bordered on intimacy. But through that entire time, through Chaplin, through Benson, through Turan, sitting over there at the Los Angeles Times in the second string critic spot was Kevin Thomas. Kevin's job as a second string critic was to see the studio wide releases that the first string critic couldn't get to, then see all the art house independent movies, then all the foreign films to play Los Angeles, which in the mid to late 70s, during the time of Lena Wertmuller, Claude Lelouch, Giancarlo Giannani, and Laura Antonelli, was a pretty cool beat. The first time many of us Los Angeles residents ever read about Wertmuller, Fassbinder, and Oshima was in Kevin Thomas's writing, but along with making foreign movies more palatable to regular LA moviegoers, the other big job Kevin Thomas had was reviewing most of the new exploitation movies coming into town from the LA Times. And in regard of both positions, nobody in the country did it better. Consequently, the first time I ever read about Russ Meyer, Jess Franco, and Dario Argento was in Kevin Thomas's writing. On most daily newspapers, the reviews of exploitation movies usually weren't written by the first or even the second string critic, but pawned off on some staff underling. Oftentimes, the assignment carrying the string of punishment, and the pieces they wrote about these flicks displayed a vindictiveness towards the film itself. They weren't just mad they had to write a review, they were mad they had to watch the movie in the first place. That was not how Kevin Thomas practiced his profession or how his aesthetic worked. He always approached every new film from American International Pictures or New World Pictures or Crown International Pictures or Canon Pictures or Empire Pictures with an open-hearted optimism and a measure of respect. Roger Corman received a lot of credit, deservedly so, for launching a lot of young filmmakers from his drive-in pictures to the major studios. Corman deserved the credit for finding these directors. Of course he did. But what really facilitated these directors moving up to studio assignments was if they received a positive notice in the Los Angeles Times from Kevin Thomas. The LA Times was the morning newspaper most agents and studio executives read. And if Kevin Thomas gave a positive notice to one of Jonathan Demme's flicks for Corman, or Joe Rubin's flicks for Crown International, or Sam Fassbinder's flicks for Canon Pictures, or Stuart Gordon's flicks for Empire, or Joe Dante's The Howling, or Louis Teague's Alligator, or Michael Lawlins' Strange Behavior, or John McTiernan's Nomads, the industry took notice. Say you're a junior agent at William Morris and you're trying to build up your client list. Or, sorry about that, just got a text. Or you're a junior executive at Warner Bros. Trying to pull in promising talent that the senior executives weren't hip to yet. When you read the Los Angeles Times over coffee in the morning and Kevin Thomas praised some filmmaker or actor in some exploitation movie that just hit town, you paid attention. So when Thomas and Jonathan Demme's Caged Heat was a good movie, you tracked down a print and watched it in the company screening room. If you agreed, you signed him up as a client or pitched him at your next meeting of the upcoming films on your slate. And when your bosses asked, who the hell is Jonathan Demme, you answered his last movie got a great write up in the LA Times. That is how those directors broke through to the studio level. Corman's position as the movie minor leagues to the studio major leagues stopped once he sold New World Pictures and opened up his new company in the 80s, Concord New Horizons. It stopped earlier than most because Corman read the writing on the wall that theatrical exhibition for the type of movies he made was becoming a thing of the past. The real market for these movies was home video. So, as opposed to in the past when theatrical box office was the primary concern, right next to the eventual television sale, theatrical exhibition simply became a contractual obligation. So, the video advertisement could proclaim straight from its theatrical release. Oftentimes in Los Angeles, that meant a dump booking at the Egyptian 3, a shoebox sized third screen attached to the historic Egyptian Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, or the Lakewood 1 or 2 and 2. But with new Corman product bypassing theatrical exhibition and going straight to home video, it also meant it was bypassing a chance to be reviewed by the local press. So, with only a few exceptions, Carl Franklin and Louis Losa, without Kevin Thomas to act as talent scout, Corman's pipeline to major studios stopped. Kevin Thomas wrote about exploitation movies the way a devoted sports writer might write about a good high school team, looking for that one player who might possibly possess the talent and potential to take themselves to the next level. And then when they moved up to the college level, he followed them and wrote whether or not they realized that potential. Then, when they made the pros, followed them to the minor leagues till finally they made it to the majors. With Kevin Thomas standing on the sidelines, rooting them on the whole way, when Jonathan Demme finally made his first film out from under the wing of Roger Corman, Citizens, Band for Paramount Studios, Thomas praised the production writing. Most gratifying of all, the film marks the graduation of Demme, one of the most talented young directors in Hollywood, from the ranks of exploitation after a substantial apprenticeship with Roger Corman that yielded that witty exploitation classic Caged Heat. And if Kevin Thomas were female, it would be easy to make a case that he seemingly permanent position as second string critic at the LA Times was a form of misogyny. But in Thomas's case, I think his editors knew no one in the business could cover his beat half as well as he did. There were a few areas where Kevin and I parted company. Thomas had a real distaste for mean spirited violence. He didn't mind graphic violence when woven into tapestry like George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead or Richard Compton's Macon County Line, but one of my favorite movies of the 70s is John Flynn's Rolling Thunder. Years later at the Torrance Public Library, when I looked up his review, I was shocked at the opening paragraph. Well into the press preview of Rolling Thunder, someone shouted, "At least it's not dull." To give the devil his due, it isn't, but otherwise it's one of the most revolting exploitation pictures to come along in some time. Damn, Kevin. But he wasn't through. Now, the point to be made about Rolling Thunder is that it's not just another cheaply made piece of junk, although junk it most assuredly is. It has been very well directed by John Flynn and superbly photographed by Jordan Cornweth. Rolling Thunder is some kind of ultimate in cynical calculation. The whole numbing predicament of the returning POW is perceptibly credibly depicted, but only to set up the carnage that follows. Then he ends the review. Of course, it could be argued that William Devane is only reaping what he sowed in Vietnam, but it will take a much less shallow picture than this to make the connection between violence and abroad, American violence abroad and at home. Obviously, I disagree, but if I had read the review, his emphasis on the film's dynamic carnage would have made me pretty gung ho to see it. Consequently, when his golden boy Jonathan Demme did his own revenge-matic for Corman, Fighting Mad with Peter Fonda, Thomas took him to task as well, starting off his review in Fighting Mad. Jonathan Demme, one of the most promising young writer-directors in exploitation pictures, has allowed violence to outweigh ideas to such a degree that the picture becomes a turnoff, little more than a blatantly obvious play to the Yahoo mentality. In my opinion, the climax of Fighting Mad isn't violent enough. In my taste in cinema, more bloodthirsty than Kevin Thomas. Clearly, I'm trying to not take that Yahoo mentality crack personality. But one man's turnoff. But the review I disagreed with the most after Rolling Thunder is his critical take on John Carpenter's Halloween. Although Carpenter and producer Deborah Hill's plot may be full of holes, Carpenter draws upon the resources of the camera to overcome them with ease. Also, his victims are well drawn and well played. With his cinematic flair, Carpenter therefore knows how to generate fear rather than suspense, and how to make us feel like voyeurs, which makes the film a complete turnoff about halfway through. So, what then is the point of all this realistically depicted slaughter and terror? With its tree shaded small town American setting, Halloween does function metaphorically for the insecure times in which we live. But since it offers nothing more, Halloween becomes yet another in the seemingly endless series of films that simply exacerbate our increasing paranoia. And what is the good of this? It's almost comical in retrospect to read Thomas Bowman, the seemingly endless series of films that simply exasperate our increasing paranoia, knowing the endless wave of slasher movies yet to come that will owe their very existence to Halloween. But again, even Kevin Thomas' negative review reads like a positive review until it gets to the point where Thomas takes psychological umbrage. As with the Rolling Thunder review, despite the vehicle, filmmaking craftsmanship always is noted, appreciated, and singled out for praise. And besides, everybody, especially a film critic, is entitled to their opinion. And if he didn't dig Halloween and found it a turnoff, so be it. But it would be interesting to see if Thomas's mind would have been changed if he saw Halloween not in a particularly empty screening room, but in a packed cinema of teenagers hooting, hollering, screaming, laughing, and basically having the time of their lives, like most of us experienced with Carpenter's pictures first opened. But then there were the times, and this never happened with his colleagues, when I felt Thomas overpraising an exploitation picture. This happened when I purchased a ticket after his enthusiastic review for the early Sarah Jessica Parker film Girls Just Want to Have Fun, which I didn't like at all. Same thing for his positive notice of the bad South African martial arts flick Kill and Kill Again, which was the sequel to the equally bad Kill or Be Killed, which I saw and thought was so lousy that I walked out after 40 minutes. I do that from time to time, but I didn't make it a habit of it. After reading Kevin's well written appreciation of the sequel, I took a chance the film would be different than the god awful original. Nope. It was just as bad. A friend of mine named Craig Hammond dubbed the film's designer genes kung fu due to the Sergio Valentes, the star James Ryan, wore throughout. After 20 minutes, I walked out of this one too, but I never begrudged Kevin Thomas his enthusiasm. Did I waste money? Yeah, but I'm not going to pretend I never gave a shit about that. I like Kevin Thomas so much, I was glad he at least had a good time. One of Thomas's gifts was pointing out tender moments from some unlikely sources. In his review for the silly and forgettable computer comedy Electric Dreams, Thomas notes that the film two leads, Lenny Von Dolan and Virginia Madsen, were bland when compared to Bud Cort, who voiced the suddenly conscious computer, Edgar, and of whom he wrote, Bud Cort reminds us of what radio acting at its best was all about, but then points out the scene where the two young leads finally grabbed him. Von Dolan and Madison really catch hold of us and each other when he confronts her on the loss of her beloved cello, crushed by the elevator doors. By way of comfort, he points out that what's important and not lost is what's inside of her, that the cello, after all, is only an instrument. Usually, when you finally saw the film in question, these moments weren't as affecting as Thomas's description of them, but still, you knew what he meant, and you appreciated his efforts in trying to distinguish something like a piece of fluff calling itself Electric Dreams. One of my favorite Kevin Thomas reviews was for Russ Meyer's Super Vexens. Like he was for Demi and Romero, Thomas was a champion of Meyer, even once acting as master of ceremonies at a festival of Russ Meyer's movies in LA, where he introduced the auteur as the only director outside of Alfred Hitchcock whose name above the title means anything. In its first few minutes, Super Vexens come on like vintage Russ Meyer, a hilarious, rambunctious combination of fast action and busty babes, but quite abruptly, Meyer, the original king of the nudies, freezes the smile on our faces with a dazzling, staged, truly terrifying sequence that, in making a direct connection between sex and violence, is truly one of the most impassioned expression of the battle of the sex ever filmed. Super Angel, Sherry Eubank, the spoiled, incredibly voluptuous, incredibly insatiable wife of a nice guy gas station attendant, Charlie Pitts, begins taunting a super macho crooked sheriff, dynamic jawed Charles Napier, for his importance. The more she teases him, the more she unleashes in him a sadistic streak and a masochistic one in himself. So, that the tension that builds between them must inevitably be resolved in an orgy of either sex or violence. And the increasing suspense as either alternative momentarily hangs in the balance before Super Angel finally pushes the sheriff too far. We are able to see how both are tragically trapped by their sexual stereotypes. As a sex pot, Super Angel is expected to demand nothing less than perfection from her lovers. As a he-man, the sheriff must be the ultimate in virility. Anyway, she incites him so much rage that she ends up stomped, then electrocuted in her bathtub, even though the sequence moves as lightning fast as the famous shower scene in Psycho. It is too grisly not to exact its toll. So shockingly, so visceral is it in its impact that it's impossible, unless you're pretty unthinking or insensitive, to laugh heartily at the subsequent lusty adventures of Pitts, now on the run since he's the prime suspect in his wife's brutal murder. However, Meyer himself is more serious than ever before. The pioneer and now past master in projecting all American male sex fantasies on the screen is in Super Vexens, reflecting the reverberations of women's liberation. Before our very eyes, sex goddess dreams turn into nightmares. Indeed, so powerful is Super Angel that she reincarnates herself as Super Vexen, now as good as she was previously evil, with her pits finds idyllic bliss until the sheriff reappears for a final battle with the couple. A blue-collar, fearless mayor used the camera as expressively and rigorously as Hitchcock or Antonioni. In his adept hands, a vast desert expanse. Virtually the entire setting for Super Vexen becomes a moral landscape. In this film, it is as if he had gone and explored, as never before, to such an extent, the dark underside of his erotic myths. It's Super Vexen's not Day of the Locust that's genuinely apocalyptic. After I read that description of the bathtub murder scene, I thought, I have to see that. And sure enough, the scene between Charles Napier and Sherry Eubank is one of the great violent sequences in 70s cinema, right up there with the climax of Straw Dogs and the rape and Deliverance, as well as the only legitimate rival to Hitchcock's shower scene in Psycho. Did the power of that scene freeze the smile on my face like it did Kevin? No, at least not for the same reason that Kevin wrote. In fact, that scene does derail the picture, but more because nothing else in the movie can complete with its power. Also, like a lot of Meyer's 70s movies, the final act dissolves into a brand of silliness that I'm not a fan of. But so what? The Napier and Eubank scene is so fucking incredible. If you excited the movie theater once it was over, you'd receive more than your money's worth for your entertainment dollar. I considered writing about super vexins for this book, but I knew I couldn't match the verve and insight that Thomas brought to bear on the picture. Also, I included that review pretty much in its entirety because it's one of my favorite of Kevin pieces, but also because it's classic Kevin. Super Vexin is really, really good, but it's ain't that good. That scene is incredible. The rest of the movie, not so much. Oftentimes, the movies Kevin rhapsodized about couldn't live up to its prose. Caged Heat is really good, but it's not as good as Kevin Thomas said it was. I love Macon County Line, but it's not as powerful as Kevin suggests, and it is, and Max Baer Jr.'s performance is no way as good. Was Kevin Thomas writing about the movies he wished they were? Maybe. Hey, I did that all through the terrible 80s, or else I would have liked anything. But sometimes, if you read Kevin's review first, the qualities Kevin attributed to the movie, he actually bestowed on the film by virtue of suggestion. There is a depth to Caged Heat, if you see it after reading Kevin's review, that it's simply not there if you watch it cold. And even though Super Vexens is more spectacular and doesn't need Thomas's help quite as much, same goes for it too. Excuse me while I rhapsodized about the time when the Los Angeles Times applauded the king of male sexual fantasies for exploring the dark undersides of his erotic myths. Here's a sampling of some of my favorite pieces that Kevin Thomas wrote about some of my favorite exploitation flicks of the 70s. Death Race 2000. A fine little exploitation picture that not only beat the similarity theme rollerball to theaters, but proved to be more coherent and pertinent of the two pictures, although made for far less money and far less time. The porn or the Pom Pom Girls. No wonder the Pom Pom Girls has been setting records for Crown International in various cities. It's an upbeat, sexy, action-filled tale of contemporary high school life that embodies perfectly what most teenagers wish their lives were like. Talented young writer, producer, director Joseph Rubin, and pro- projecting this post-adolescent fantasy, observes the rules. His young people raise hell, but they aren't vicious, cruel, or destructive. Even though vehemently anti-intellectual, they're a pretty likable bunch, possessing some dimension and, most important, vulnerability. As a result, and because it has an abundant sense of humor, the Pom Pom Girls succeed as an evocation of the kind of freedom that youth symbolizes, but particularly no one today or the past ever really gets to enjoy. The Lords of Flatbush. With poignant perception, the Lords of Flatbush suggests that growing up in the 50s was pretty much the same in Brooklyn as it was in San Rafael or Modesto, American Graffiti, or even a dying Texas town, The Last Picture Show. In each instance, we're shown high school kids fighting off boredom and struggling with the conflict between their sexual frustrations and an arbitrary, hypocritical moral code. The Lords of Flatbush was shot in 16 millimeter for 380,000 and then blown up to 35 serves only the heightened sense of reality's harshness, closer in spirit to Mean Streets, but not as despairing. Then so American Graffiti, it is a very New Yorkish film with its emphasis on characterization and dialogue rather than visual style. Its creators clearly know their people well and care for them deeply, inviting us to share their feelings, a film of acute observation and telling nuances. The Lords of Flatbush is full of devastating vignettes. Hollywood Boulevard. At least as far back as Morton of the movies, 1924, Hollywood has been turning its cameras on itself, generally with satirical and often savage intent. But there's never been anything quite like Hollywood Boulevard, an outrageous, often hilarious spoof of the zany world of low-budget exploitation filmmaking. And what better company to produce such an effort than Roger Corman's New World Pictures? To be sure, New World knows its audience too well to attempt anything like an authentic glimpse of the actual hectic, often ruthless and desperate existence of aspiring young talent. Rather, it has played everything very, very broad, making certain there's plenty of fast action and above the waist nudity to satisfy the fans of the very films it's making fun of. Yet it is also sufficiently imaginative and knowledgeable to amuse film buffs. Malibu High. The title Malibu High suggests a bouncy summer romance featuring sand, surf, and bikinis. Actually, it's anything but that. It tells of an 18-year-old girl, Phil Lansing, an experienced but intense young actress who hates school and is on the verge of flunking out and despise her nagging mother, whom she blames for her father's suicide when her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, throws her over for a rich girl. That's the last straw. In revenge, she decides to seduce her teachers into giving her A's, turns hooker to get money to buy the luxury she craves, and discovers she gets a kick out of killing people. All this is as sordid as it sounds, but whether by accident or design, director Irv Berwick and writers John Buckley and Tom Singer so identify with their heroine that the film becomes a surprisingly compassionate study in obsession. They never make fun of the absurdity of her determination to graduate from high school merely as a fierce point of pride, nor do they satirize her complete naivete as she becomes a pawn for her underworld pimp, Garth Howard, who gets her to kill for him but treats her with unfailing, therefore, seemingly authentic tenderness and respect. This girl brings to mind the frustrated nurse of the B classic The Honeymoon Killers, who would never have turned murderer had she not fallen for a greasy little gigolo, and also Truffaut's equally obsessive Adele H in her extreme reaction to Taylor's rejection of her. Produced at the age of 18 by Lawrence D. Folds, who claims to be Hollywood's youngest producer, and he may well be, Malibu High is often awkward and crude, yet it's too oddly compelling to be dismissed as the trash it would seem so clearly to be. The girl's story may be utterly improbable, but her corruption is persuasive. In this, she's not in so unluckily Louis Brooks' Lulu and Pandora's Box. Malibu High is a seedy, sleazy little gem best appreciated by cineastas. When I read his review of Malibu High, I ran out and saw it that very night, and he was entirely correct. As crudy as this little tawdry flick was, it had an undeniable power, and the lead actress Jill Lansing, who never appeared in anything else again, proceeded to get better and better as the film unspooled till by the final reel. When she's standing naked, towering over the body of one of her victims, she delivers a disreputable tour de force on par with Georgina Spelvin in The Devil and Miss Jones. One review Kevin Thomas wrote in 1980 that I read when I was 18 years old was to have a significant impact on my film work 17 years later. It was a review for the Louis Teague directed John Sayles scripted Jaws ripoff Alligator. At the time, Sayles had just made his directorial debut with the minuscule budget independent film The Return of this, what is that? Secaucus 7, which, as opposed to the films he was paid to write, was not a genre film. In fact, it's the story of a reunion of some 60s former college students, radicals, predating Lawrence Kasdan's The Big Chill. In his review of the giant alligator movie, which he referred to as well made and lots of fun, Kevin focused on the two lead performances of Robert Forster and Robin Riker, who, he wrote, are delightful and relaxed under Teague's direction. But then he wrote the line that was to stay in my mind all those years. There's an easygoing naturalness to Forster and Riker that makes them seem like one of the couples in Return of the Secaucus 7. Now that people barely remember the Return of the Secaucus 7, that may not read as much a big deal, but then Secaucus 7 was the critical darling of the year. and to imply the genre characters in a Jaws ripoff about a giant alligator contained the same vers- verisimilitude as the independent hit of the season was bold proclamation. I saw Alligator 3 times that year. One of those times was a triple feature with Rolling Thunder and a Canadian trucker flick called High Ballin' with Peter Fonda and Jerry Reed, and I agreed wholeheartedly with Kevin Thomas about the charm of Forster and Riker. So much so, when I did my top 10 movies at the end of the year and wrote my little awards, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Director, it was Robert Forster who was my choice for Best Male Performance of the Year. Robert De Niro for Raging Bull was number 2. 15 years later, I was writing my adaptation of Elmore Leonard's Rum Punch, which I retitled Jackie Brown, and I had to consider who was to play the novel's likable lead male character, Bill Bondsman, Max Cherry. I had a few choices. Gene Hackman was an obvious choice, as well as Paul Newman. I also considered John Saxon, but there was something about Forster and Alligator that really stuck with me. I watched the movie again and felt that the character from Alligator could be Max Cherry, just 15 years earlier. So I started writing the script as if he was, right down to the discussion with Jackie about his thinning hair. Would I have done that without Kevin Thomas's highlighting Forster so positively in his review? No. In the end, what made Kevin Thomas so unique in the world of 70s and 80s film criticism, he seemed like one of the only few practitioners who truly enjoyed their job and consequently their life. I loved reading him growing up and practically considered him a friend. In 1994, I won an award for Pulp Fiction from the Los Angeles Film Critiques Association. When I stepped up to the podium and looked out before the audience of LA critics, my first remarks to the room were, gee, thanks, now I finally know what Kevin Thomas looks like. It's pretty funny. Not bad. Not bad there. Pretty interesting read. Tomorrow we will continue, same time, 9 p.m. Central, the 8th section called New Hollywood in the 70s, the post 60s anti establishment auteurs versus the movie Brats. That should be fun. That sounds interesting. Seems kind of short. I don't know. So, yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody who was here. Cardi Key, thanks for stopping by. Rodolfo, as always, a pleasure. Thank you, as always, for stopping by. You're my number one fan. I'm a fan of yours, is what I'm saying. You're my number one YouTube guy that visits me. You know what I'm saying? Really appreciate you. Krishna, you're my brother. I don't forget about you. I don't know if he's still on, but yeah, not bad. I enjoyed that. You always get these little nuggets of interesting facts about that time that I would be completely unaware of because I was born in '86, so you know my life was mainly late '80s, '90s. My childhood. So that was a whole different experience for me. So I missed out on all these kinds of movies that he talks about. So it's kind of interesting to get an insight like this into that time. It really is. Kevin Thomas. Kevin Thomas. Yeah, check him out. I wonder if he's still writing. He might have retired by now. Anyways, I'll bookmark it here. This is page 159. Making a dent in the book now. Made a serious dent in the book. Look how many pages we read. We're getting close to halfway. Look at that. Anyways, I appreciate everybody who stopped in for the read and whatnot. So if you enjoyed that, you're welcome to join me tomorrow. And yeah, looking forward to it. So everybody have a good night.